Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So the current paper that I'm presenting is a chapter from my dissertation, or a section of a chapter from my dissertation, which is, the dissertation more broadly speaking is concerned with Islamist political thought among Islamist ulama and how it's developed over the last 30 or so years. Broadly speaking, someone like Jasir Auda would actually be considered to be one of the Islamist ulama that I'm writing about. Although he is exceptional in that he's trained in a Western sort of academic setting as well. In this particular chapter, I'm going to consider his work that was written in the wake of the Arab Spring, early 2011, late 2010, early 2011, and it was published in 2012, and it has a certain degree of optimism to it, but I'm specifically concerned with his questions of specific questions that arise pertaining to specific fiqh issues relating to governance, and it's a sort of blend of both fiqh and usul discourse that you see in this work, and the work in particular is called أسئلة ما بعد الثورة بين الشريعة والسياسة. It's a short work. You can actually download it off his website. It's about 200 pages, I think, roughly. I'll be focusing primarily on this work, which was written, of course, before the counter-revolution, and attempting to adapt the Islamic religious tradition to the context of a modern nation state, and, as we will see, more generally to Western modernity. Of particular interest for the purpose of this paper is how Auda's work moves away from traditional Islamic juristic legal registers to one that could be characterized as having a more substantively ethical register. By substantive ethics, I mean to suggest that it seems to be inspired in part by ethical impulses that arise from extra-scriptural sources. So this goes back to a question that we've been dealing with from day one, actually. Professor Sajidina actually raised this, which is the question of husn and qubh, the idea of good and evil, and whether human beings have the ability to assess that. And this really lies at the heart of a lot of contemporary debates and contemporary shifts in fiqh discourse. In any case, hopefully what I mean by this specifically will become more clear as I proceed with the paper. And I expect I have 50 past.
Yeah.
Okay. So, a cursory glance at the contents of Auda's short book gives a plain impression that it is a work that contends with the ideological interplay between Western values and the 20th century Islamist ones. In large part, these are questions of how these two value systems can be brought closer to each other, and as we shall see in more specific details below. In some respects, Auda represents a new trend in Islamist writing that seeks a greater rapprochement with Western values rather than the less compromising rejectionist stances of Islamists of the past century. And those Islamists, particularly the Qutbiyin, for example, the followers of Sayyid Qutb, who was perhaps the most influential Islamist in the Middle East in the later half of the 20th century, are very much uncompromising in their stances to the West, and would insist that Western values have no normative authority whatsoever. Rather than such an old-school Islamist outlook, Auda would not, rather such old Islamist outlooks would assert that one must yield to God's authority, often in accordance with a particularly narrowly constituted view of what this authority is. So this isn't necessarily what the Islamic tradition has to say, but what this tradition of Islamism came to see as the Islamic tradition. So it's a relatively narrow view of Islam. By contrast, Auda actually has a far more broader outlook, and it's probably in part due to his sort of breadth in both the Islamic tradition, but also in Western learning. Now, one question that comes up, and I think this can be seen as a defining point for the assessment of good and evil is the question of justice. And one of the things that Auda highlights at the outset of this book is that the Sharia, which is a major issue, a major consideration for Islamists, it's one of their talking points, the Sharia is really concerned overall with upholding justice. And in order to sort of support this claim, and this is a universally accepted claim, but we've already heard from Professor Ibrahim Musa, the locus classicus for this sentiment in the Islamic tradition, and this is Ibn al-Qayyim's statement in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, that the Sharia is built and founded upon wisdom and the interests masalih of God's servants in this life and the next. So the Sharia is all about wisdom. It is in every respect justice, in every respect concerned with people's interests, in every respect wisdom or hikmah. Thus, if any ruling that forsakes justice for injustice, or mercy for its opposite, or people's interests, it forsakes people's interests for what is harmful, or forsakes wisdom for futility, then it is not of the Sharia, even if it is introduced into the Sharia through some sort of interpretation. So this is this sentiment is one which is very frequently heard in our own time, that the Sharia is about justice. But Auda does not articulate, nor do many of the people who cite this sort of statement, in any detail a theoretical conception of what constitutes justice. And this isn't really a serious preoccupation among contemporary Islamists, unlike their Western counterparts. And by that I'm referring to the fact that in the West, certainly since the writings of John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, the articulation of what the implications of upholding justice are have been sort of the focus of a lot of political philosophy. Whereas for someone like Auda, who is actually, you could say, a serious political philosopher in the Muslim world, he will just suffice with the notion of justice. He'll say it is enough for us to uphold justice. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing. One of the things I'm highlighting in noting this is that we are, someone like Auda and in the modern world, we are sort of under a Western hegemonic discourse which obliges us to adapt to to the sort of, when I say there, I mean I'm a Westerner as well, so it's a very sort of interesting place to be, but it forces us to adapt to a tradition of intellectual reflection. And that's why someone like Auda or so many people will be highlighting notions of justice, but obviously the Western tradition has its own trajectory, and so in many respects we do not, there's nothing to say that if you haven't articulated detailed conceptions of justice, that therefore your systems of thought are in any way inferior, necessarily. But the interesting question to my mind is whether this conception of justice is informed, of Auda's or other Islamists, is informed by what a contemporary scholar, Andre Iman, at Toronto, refers to as hard naturalism. So in his book, Islamic Natural Law Theories, Andre Iman talks about the Mu'tazila as having a hard naturalist outlook on conceptions of good and evil, by which he means that we can conceive of what is good and evil through engaging in rational inquiry, as opposed to, so that's the Mu'tazili view, as opposed to the more voluntarist conceptions of, for example, traditional Ash'arism, in which justice is actually defined through the authority of Scripture. This is very schematic. There's a lot more complexity to this question, and I would recommend reading Andre Iman's book to see how sort of Ash'arism actually has something of a midpoint between these two views. But this could be considered the Islamic version of Plato's Euthyphro dilemma, or the in the Islamic tradition it's referred to the Masalat al-Tahsin al-Tatbiq. In essence, the issue boils down to whether to a stance of either a given thing, X is good because God commands X, which is the voluntarist perspective, or X is good because God commands X, which is basically divine command voluntarism, or X is good and therefore God commands X, which is the hard naturalist perspective, which says that God is obliged to follow external considerations of good and evil, and therefore God imposes certain commands. The question posed in this manner entails that either what is good is entirely dependent on God's commands and hence not open to human rational inquiry, or it is entirely independent of God's command. And in that case, God commands X only because it is good by some independent measure, which in turn is open to human rational inquiry. In the former, God commands X, and God's commanding X makes it good, as or that God sort of commands that one not do X, that would make it evil. According to Iman, mainstream Sunni orthodoxy settled in a middle position between the voluntarist and the hard naturalist schools, what he calls soft naturalism, in that they accepted that God had ordered the world in a way that we could still rationally assess it. And this is the source of maslaha discourse that we have in usul al-fiqh. And it's an interesting sort of tension there that, in a sense, allows for, even if you believe that it's God's commands that make things good or bad, by asserting that he actually has made the world a good place or something that is amenable to rational inquiry, it can potentially come very close to a Mu'tazili position. But at the same time, there always appears to have been a reluctance in the Islamic tradition, and certainly in the Sunni Islamic tradition. Of course, the Shia Islamic tradition has a completely different engagement with Mu'tazilism. There's always been a reluctance to give the intellect free rein in assessing what is good and bad, entirely free of scriptural considerations. And this you even have in someone like Jasir Auda, who tries to derive the maqasid from a sort of inductive reading of the scriptural sources. And this is true for the sort of perhaps most important scholar who articulated the idea of maqasid al-sharia in Islamic history, Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, but it's certainly true for modern scholars like Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, who is also one of the proponents of this style of discourse. Now, that sort of gives some groundwork in terms of how we conceive of good and evil in the Islamic tradition and different perspectives. Let me shift gear to looking at some of the things that Jasir Auda is doing with respect to political discourse. And one issue I want to highlight is a shift from using the term mabadi and preferring that over the term ahkam. And this was a debate that was ongoing in the Egyptian revolution and constitutional debates of 2012, where the Salafis were trying to say that the constitution should mention that we consider the ahkam of the sharia or the rulings of the sharia to have binding precedence, be of a binding quality for the state, whereas the traditional sort of Egyptian constitution said the mabadi of the sharia or the principles of the sharia should be the guiding lights. And there's a good article by Clark Lombardi and Nathan Brown, which talks about how the modern judiciary in Egypt essentially preferred the mabadi position because it allowed them to interpret the sharia in a very sort of loose way and allow for their own legal experience to guide how they interpret the sharia. But in any case, one of the things I want to highlight is that by focusing on mabadi, and in talking about mabadi, Jasir Auda actually says the mabadi are essentially the maqasid of sharia. And this is his sort of intervention in this instance. By using a term like mabadi, he is opening up new terrain in the Islamic legal and juristic discourse. A term like mabadi doesn't have precedence as a stable technical term in the usul al-fiqh literature, whereas a term like ahkam means something very specific in the Islamic juristic literature. So what this allows for is a shift away from traditional juristic reasoning and traditional ahkam. So ahkam also refers specifically to fiqh, ahkam fiqhiyya. And so essentially what I'm suggesting is it allows for the opening of a vast array of space without being tied too much to the juristic tradition, to the fiqh tradition. At the same time, we heard yesterday how he still will, he'll come up with a ruling, but he will look for precedent. And I'll address that towards the end of the paper. The idea that really the guiding principle remains in the Islamic tradition. The guiding principle remains in the tradition. You have to somehow maintain a continuity with the tradition if you want to have any impact. And I think this will become an interesting discussion point, because it sort of arose as a bone of contention in previous discussions. So in any case, I'm not going to go into any detail about what the maqasid are. This has been, we're in Triple IT after all, and this has been articulated. The three sort of darurat, hajiyah, tahsiniyah, and then the darurat dividing into the 5, or in some cases 6, universal principles which need to be preserved in the Sharia. I won't go into all of this. For our purposes, what I'm looking at, or what I'm considering here, is that this is being used in a sense to bypass the constriction from some perspectives and the restrictions of the traditional fiqh discourse. Auda is hardly new in this regard, but he's the reason I focus on him is because he has a fairly rigorously articulated usul. Just one example of how, even in the articulation of the maqasid themselves, there are important shifts. So, for example, one of the considerations in maqasid or the darurat is hifdud-din. One of the 5 things which have to be preserved. The religion is to be preserved. And this is actually expanded, and he's here following another contemporary, an earlier contemporary, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, who died in 1973. This is expanded to say the Sharia has come to preserve all religions. And beyond that, to preserve freedom of religion in some sense. Even though this is and David's paper tomorrow, I'll maybe highlight this point in my, and I'm still deciding whether to highlight this point about the nature of freedom of religion in an Islamic conception is quite different from the nature of freedom of religion in the Western conceptions, because Auda considers apostasy a sin, even though he argues against the fact that it should be punishable by death. But the reason I mention this is that here you have the expansion of traditional conceptions, even of maqasid al-sharia, to take into consideration what I think are pluralistic concerns. And these are very distinctive concerns brought about by modernity. Okay, he also speaks, for example, about human rights, and the adoption of such language as human rights discourse, I think, places a certain degree of pressure on traditional Islamic fiqh, for example, because a lot of what is considered universal human rights in our own time would, in some respects, stand in tension or stand explicitly against ijmas of the past. And I know Professor Sajidina has written about human rights, and but I mean, I think even his work really highlights the fact that there needs to be this sort of work, highlights the high degree of tension between concepts of human rights as conceived in a liberal context and in traditional Islamic language, what would be considered like that. It's a completely different idea. Not completely different, but it's a different conception. Okay, so I have 10 minutes, so I'm only halfway through, so I'm going to abbreviate certain sections. One of the points that I wanted to make is that even though Auda is, one could argue that Auda is capitulating. This is the argument from traditionalist critics. Auda is capitulating to Western pressure. But one of the things he does in sort of adopting terms like human rights, for example, is that he's asserting a certain degree of autonomy from outside pressure. And this is quite ironic, because he's adopting this term because it's part of the sort of global near-hegemonic discourse. But at the same time, he will use it, the idea of human rights, to say, no, we have a slightly different conception of human rights. And he presents a distinction between what he describes as truly universal human rights, that all of humanity agrees on, such as the right to life, freedom of choice, protection from torture, freedom of expression, judicial justice. And even here, I mean, there are certain things which he's taking on certain ideas which can have certain implications which can go against the Sharia in certain of its interpretations. But at the same time, he says, at the same time, powerful nations are not to impose specific conceptions of human rights that they deem to be universal upon others. So he's taking a concept like human rights, but he's using it to defend his own territory. And this is, I'm not an expert on subaltern studies, but I expect this is one way in which subalterns defend their terrain. Okay. Now, I want to actually maybe close with some concrete examples, and in some cases some very striking examples of exactly what he is advocating in the fiqh tradition. So, for example, he notes that when it comes to prophetic, and he's talking about politics here, when it comes to prophetic practices in the realms of politics, these aren't necessarily to be considered representative binding norms for all time in Islamic governance. A fairly straightforward example he gives is, for example, the manner in which the Prophet organized his armies. This is obviously a political consideration, that the Prophet had flanks in his armies, and he had a front and a rear guard and so on. But these are based on really expediency in a given circumstance. So they can't really be considered binding precedent in the Islamic fiqh tradition. But perhaps a more striking example comes from the Quran, a source which is, on the surface, not contestable. But this comes with respect to the verses on the spoils of war. فَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّمَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَأَنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ. Know that whatever you have sort of won in terms of war spoils, for God is a fifth of them, and for His Messenger. And Auda asserts that this can only really be representative of a political concern in the same way that we had from the example of the Sunnah just given, and therefore it's amenable to maqasid-based reinterpretation, because what you're looking at is what is the overall goal of this act. So here we have specific verses of the Quran which are being. He suggests, for example, that now you have salaried armies, so they don't deserve to get a share of the war spoils. But this is a reinterpretation of the verse in the Quran. Another, perhaps more striking example is, even more striking than the last, is with respect to the jizya and the hudud. It's more striking, and then it's also less striking, because these are things which keep on popping up in the discourse. And he says, in the same way, the idea of jizya, or the fact that non-Muslims in a Muslim polity should pay a certain tax for their staying in that polity, this is again a maqasid-oriented, maqasid-based consideration, which does not need to be applied any longer. And he gives specific reasoning for this, saying that the jizya was there to spare people from enlisting in the army, which is one of the interpretations historically that's been given. But in my reading, and I'm still reading, no one in Islamic history, no mufassir or faqih, has ever suggested from that the jizya just can be done away with because of its being something from the Quran. In the same way, he treats the hudud, and I haven't really dealt with the hudud in this paper. Maybe it can come out in the discussion. But I mean, I think these sorts of shifts are striking in that they're basically opening to question Quranic verses themselves. Now, in certain instances, this is actually really uncontestable, I think. Even the most hard-nosed fundamentalist or literalist reader of the Quran would admit that verses which talk about وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِّبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ, for war, that you should prepare your horses to go into battle. Even the most literalist reader of the Quran would say that this has to be understood in context. It has to be understood in a purposive, maqasid-based sense. But so what is the criterion for measuring whether something is acceptable or not? That criterion Auda draws on the controversial Hanbali scholar from the 8th, 14th century. He dies in the 8th, 14th century. Najmuddin al-Tufi, and he says that anything that is a matter not of strict ibadat or muqaddarat, which I translate as measurable, innumerable quality, in the scriptures can be changed according to maslaha-based, purposive, or maqasid-based reasoning. And so when you do something like that, then you place some restrictions on the material. You can then say, okay, this is an act of worship, so we're not going to change it. But then we had this discussion on day one, actually, when Dr. Brazinji was talking about the fact that even something like Hajj should be amenable to that sort of reinterpretation. And I asked back then that what does this mean for prayers? Because prayers is certainly about you can read maqasid in prayers in the Quran. Inna salat tanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkar. Prayer is about purifying your character and so on. So if you develop other techniques for doing that, should that be sort of a means of abrogating prayer? Let me close with, that's a tension which I just want to leave out there. I don't have an answer. I think this is one of the tensions of modernity, and I find modernity an exhilarating experience, and one of the various tensions. But let me close with just a comment. One of the things he mentions is that really the most important consideration when it comes to deciding which factors are to be decided according to maqasid and which are to be decided according to the texts themselves, this question goes back to the ulama. So even someone like Jasir Auda, who and he is himself an alim, is going to lean back on the tradition, because I think this is a pragmatic consideration. At the end of the day, whatever ijtihads, Sherman Jackson talks about this in his Islam to Understand, whatever ijtihads are proposed, they may be radical, may be sort of really limited, they may be really relevant. As long as the tradition as a whole does not accept it, and this is usually done through the gateway of the ulama, there'll just be another idea out there. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.